Hello, I'm Soycat, and welcome to the start of a brand new second channel series where I'll be diving into the most populated country for each letter of the alphabet. Over the next 24 days, we'll go through the entire alphabet, all 24 letters of it, and go into some countries which are heavily populated but you might not have otherwise known about, and explain what's going on with their border situation, the external world around them, which shapes how they see it, indeed the internal border situation, the subdivisions, and the way which a country divides itself, as well as the demographics that make up its future. This should be an interesting way to learn about countries that have large numbers of people living there that you otherwise might not have known too much about, and so hopefully you enjoy this series. And indeed, it's fun to work out, for each letter has an interesting case of like, well, what's it going to be? Because in the case of A, there's a lot of A countries around the world, but the most populated A is, of course, as the title hopefully tells you, Algeria. Algeria is the 10th largest country on the planet Earth, but it's still surprising, even though it has so much area, for it to have so many people in there, because it's kind of like Russia, where Russia has a lot of land area, but how much of it is really usable? Algeria has very much the same situation going on, where they are a sub-Saharan African country, and so even just using the basic colors from Google, you can see that the majority of the country is yellow in a way that indicates it's not going to have large numbers of people there, but indeed, as we dive into the borders, you'll learn a bit more about that geography. Because title card. I know, it's second channel, right? It's the first letter of the alphabet, but we already have a situation where telling you how many borders Algeria has is actually a bit controversial. If you were to ask the country themselves, they border 7 separate nations. If you were to ask the United Nations or any other government, they officially border 6. How does this happen? Well, Algeria borders, from a clockwise fashion, Tunisia, Libya, Niger, Mali, Mauritania, as well as Morocco, and maybe there's this little bit of Western Sahara that they border right here, and Google isn't getting involved in that one. However, the international community does not recognize Western Sahara, but Algeria does. This leads to some fun tensions with Morocco over there, but to dive into the rest of their border situations, you can see that they do have one of these infamous straight line borders for lots of their, their international their territory divisions here, and this is something lots of people find controversial, because generally speaking, when you look at a border, if you see that it's made of lots of clear lines, that defines it's, demarked by some form of actual border between countries, whereas when it's a straight line, it was 2 people in a room who didn't know what they were drawing, saying, yep, let's do it right there. But ultimately, when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, this is something that is basically needed, because although they're on, in the case of Algeria and Morocco, they do have a little bit of a river border, which is a great way to do things, a physical strip of water, but ultimately the Sahara is better than having water between you and another nation, because it's basically like having a fire border. Good luck crossing it in any realistic time, and so indeed, from Mauritania to Algeria is effectively a journey you wouldn't make directly between those countries, despite them sharing a very large straight border, and that's why they've left it straight for all this time. With Mali, although there are so many recommendations from every place I could find saying do not go to this border, it is worth mentioning that they do actually have a few small settlements along it, and indeed roads to connect them, but the border I find most interesting is Algeria and Niger's, because this is an almost perfectly straight line, and it's almost 1,000 kilometers long, but has one border crossing. There is only one way to go from Algeria to Niger, legally or officially, and it is via the Trans-Saharan Highway, which I think was fun enough by itself to discover. There is a paved highway going through the Saharan desert, but then I learned that it's specifically only for military convoys, and I got a little bit sadder. However, something which is absolutely fascinating, if only to me, is the fact that if you are to, Algeria has a lot of people crossing this border, basically coming from the rest of Africa to come to Algeria, because then you're only one step away from getting to Europe, which is the end destination for all of these people, and so Algeria's stance on it is to say, if you come into our country illegally via this border crossing, we will drop you off right here at this checkpoint in the middle of the Sahara Desert with no supplies, no nothing. Work it out for yourself. And although, again, this is a very interesting response to many things in the world, it is something that leaves you in a very scary situation and makes you realize that, yeah, this is the same as, whatever you believe on this matter, it's the same as an island country dropping someone off at sea and saying, go deal with it yourself. Ultimately, the Sahara Desert is a situation that will lead to your death if you are not prepared for it, and so they drop them off at the Ring of Fire, and that is a fascinating way to prove to many people who don't believe it that yes, they effectively have a fire border. Speaking of fire borders, Algeria and Libya have a border that comes from the Italian colonial times and the French colonial times. Famously, Algeria was a part of France that they fully considered a part of the country. It was not like a colony or anything. It was like, yeah, France is here and France is over here. That kind of ended a little bit, but because this border was in place for most of of its history. It leads to an interesting situation with Libya, which was an Italian colony. France beat Libya in one of those wars at some point, and so they got to redraw the border. But fascinatingly, after looking into how they redrew the border, it used to be a very straight line between Gahatz over here, or Gahatz, I don't know how you'd say it, and Gadames over here. However, they redrew it to slightly give a tiny bit more territory to France, which now means they have an international border, which effectively hasn't changed in terms of which people are in there. Is it just France trying to get a technical victory? Is there some fun reason we don't know about to this day? I don't know. And then there is the French border between Algeria and Tunisia. Interestingly, the reason that Algeria is so big, it's the 10th largest on the planet, is solely because of France's, expansion with Algeria against Morocco. Morocco had its independence kind of guaranteed by France there in exchange for taking a much shorter borderline. And so when you look at northern African countries, they're all pretty darn big. Tunisia and Morocco are the big exceptions here. However, the reason Morocco is so small is because they did control a lot of this territory before, but in very unofficial ways, because it's the desert. Good luck administering that and putting fence posts in the ground. And so, yeah, Morocco eventually did have to cede a lot of its land, and then, if I'm not mistaken, it ended up getting colonized by Europeans anyway, so maybe it wasn't a good agreement in the end term. But the long story short of this is to say that Morocco has a very natural border, which is basically as far as Algeria could push inland across mountains and rivers and stuff like that, whereas every other border is some form of, border from a pre-Algerian time, which is interesting to say because when we look at the way that Algeria divides itself, it's basically the opposite. Every country divides itself into smaller units, which is the reason for this provinces and subdivisions section, because some of these provinces and subdivisions are very widely known about. India, for example, even if you don't know them, you'd be very aware that it's divided into states. The United Kingdom is divided into countries. Brazil has its states, and the United States and Canada has its provinces, and these are the things that actually make up the bigger country. To the world, a country has to pretend it's one perfectly united thing, but internally it has to represent these smaller divisions. And so what is Algeria made up of? Well, interestingly enough, it's made up of provinces, and there are 48 of these. However, unlike with many other places where these provinces or these states or Bundeslands have existed for forever and basically had to form together to make up the country, it's the opposite with Algeria. Algeria divides itself and is continuously adding more. They added some even as soon as 2019, and so basically when you look at the list of Algerian provinces, you've got a very artificial creation. Indeed, they're also governed in a way that feels a bit artificial. You have a governor, or they use a fun word in Arabic for it, for each of these provinces, but they're all governors who are basically given political jobs from the central Algerian government, and so, it is, technically speaking, a provincial system, but very much one where they all cede power to the main person who then gives them the power to elect. And indeed, when you look at this, province of Algeria map, not only does it look like, wow, the big provinces in the south, are those the really, really huge ones for the people living there? The answer is no. If we look at 42, for example, which is Tamganhasset, as I am definitely pronouncing correctly, if we go look at their population, it's 176,637. That is despite having a surface area the size of, I don't know, like Wales, maybe England. It's a ridiculously sized surface area, but it has a population which is, much smaller than any of the ones from the north. Biskra has 721,000, Bajaya has 912,000, Batna has 1.1 million. They have much larger populations when they are these tiny blobs in the north, because as is the logical case in much of North Africa, there is a very, 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 a useful strip in the north, and then it gets a little more questionable as you go far south to the point where how big is this settlement? Actually, this is a pretty big one right here, but how big are the settlements once you get really close to the border? Very, very, very small. This is the only town for hundreds of kilometers around, and it is, it's got a couple of hotels, it's got a supermarket, it's got a catering place. Long story short, Algeria is divided into provinces, but those provinces are kind of in the sense of, can a province ever be real, or is it made up by a country? It is a weak province system, which means that they do not have much power from the central government, and indeed they are very, very, very concentrated to the north for pretty decent reasons. However, what else would you want to learn about Algeria? One of my favorite things to learn about any country is the population and where it's heading in the future. Is Algeria growing or shrinking? Well, there's a fun answer to that. Algeria's population of 45 million is in fact due to grow over the next 100 years, but in a very stable, consistent way, and this population pyramid will tell you exactly why. Unlike many countries which have a bulge in the population, then they're kind of done, Algeria has this lovely kind of flaring at the base, which is exactly what you want, because it means that they're having a large number of people being born right now. This means that although they should have a bunch of retirees due in 20 years, right now these people are about to be going through the best years economically of their life. And so indeed, when you look at the number of new people being born, this should lead to a larger and larger economy each and every year. A big struggle for countries outside of Africa is growing the population, and even African countries, once they get to the stage where they get middle or higher incomes, like many African countries do, they start to fade away and they start to lose this population rate. But Algeria is in fact going through a sustained increase. It's not as high as their neighbors, which, you know, can be down, if you can handle a tripling in your population every 10 years, would be great. However, to go sustainably up and have a demographic crisis, which can only be explained as, well, the biggest problem is they have far fewer women than men. They are indeed a culture that is still sticking to that set of rules where you want to have a man, you don't want to have a woman, because and so you can see that there is a crazy gender imbalance. Many Western countries, once you get to a certain point in safety and income, start to see the reverse trend. But for every, you know, in the last 5 years, 2.4 million baby boys were born, while 2.3 million baby girls were born. That is 100,000 men who will not have a partner and will not have anything else. And the same is true across basically the entire pyramid. 100,000 every 5 years, men who do not have a corresponding lady. This has all sorts of, you know, this isn't meant to be some perfectly, well, the population pairs that way, but on average, you take one of each for one of each. And so there is a very, very slight crisis that comes from that. But it is, again, it's on such mild numbers that every single tiny problem you can point at, including the small lack of people who are teenagers right now, will eventually be solved with population. And so what is going on with Algeria? The answer is pretty good things overall. I would say, looking at the country economically, having as much oil as Algeria does, being a valuable place in the region, makes it somewhere you want to go, which is, I guess, the final question we should ask. Do you want to go to Algeria? Well, officially, I'm going to give you the Gov UK response to this. You should go to Algeria, if you follow their advice, for everywhere except the border regions. You can't cross from Morocco to Algeria. They're having a bit of a spat over the Western Sahara thing right now. Maybe Algeria, helped out the Western Saharan rebels. Maybe they don't have a good relationship. Who's to say for sure? But yeah, basically, you cannot go anywhere near a border, anywhere else in the country. Advise against all travel. And if you're going to go anywhere else, just be aware that you can't demonstrate or protest. That's pretty normal. There's terrorists that are likely to carry out attacks, including kidnappings. Okay, that's normal. That's fine. When moving around, try to avoid areas you don't know after dark. Traveling in rural areas and at night is particularly risky, and it's advisable to always travel a reputable guide or companion. So yeah, just don't travel at night or in places you don't know, and you'll do great, which is, I mean, it's technically travel advice, but I feel like for the most part, you're gonna fly into Algiers International, an airport, which is entirely fine, and a city, which by the way has a metro, isn't that fun. Anyway, speaking of things that are fun, this video has been a lot of it, and is the start of a brand new series we'll be doing for every single country. It is fun to imagine. What is the, I think it's fun, without, off the top of your head, can you say the most populated country for each letter? For B, for example, is it Burundi? Is it Belgium? You know, Belgium's got a lot of people. Is it the Bahamas? Are we going to be going all the way over, there's a lot of B countries. Which one has the biggest population? You know, it's going to be Brunei. I know it. But come back tomorrow to find out more about a new country which you might not have known too much about. I hope you enjoyed this slightly fun format with a slight bit more effort. But as always, thank you for watching. Second channel, don't care. Goodbye.